The photograph was taken in the summer of 1976, deep in the rainforest of southeastern Ecuador. It shows a group of men in expedition gear standing at the mouth of a cave, a black opening in the jungle floor, dropping straight down into the dark. Most of the men in the photograph were British soldiers and scientists. The Shuar guides standing at the edge of the frame were local men who knew the cave, and who, by most accounts, did not particularly want anyone going into it. And near the center of the photograph stands a quiet American in his mid-40s, whose face, even here, thousands of miles from home and streaked with jungle humidity, is instantly recognizable. 7 years earlier, he had become the first human being in history to set foot on the moon. His name was Neil Armstrong. He was not there for a ceremony. He was not there to cut a ribbon. He had traveled from the United States to the Ecuadorian Amazon to be lowered on a steel cable through a hole in the jungle floor into one of the largest and least explored cave systems in South America, a place the local Shuar people had guarded for as long as anyone could remember, and a place that, according to a story sworn before a public notary just 7 years earlier, contained something that had no business existing. A library, not a library of paper, a library of metal. Thousands of engraved sheets, stacked in the dark, said to record the history of a civilization no one has ever identified. The expedition Armstrong joined was, and still is, the largest cave exploration ever mounted. More than 100 people, 2 governments, military engineers, professional speleologists, zoologists, archaeologists, all of it aimed at one cave in the middle of the jungle. Officially, it was science. And genuine science was done. But nobody assembles the largest cave expedition in history, with the most famous man alive at the top of the roster, to look at birds. Today, we're examining the traditions of the Shuar, the Notarized Claim of 1969, the strange collection of a priest in Cuenca, and the documented record of what happened when the first man on the moon went into the earth, and why, for the rest of his life, he almost never spoke about what he saw there. Was the metal library a fantasy that swallowed reasonable men? Or did the Shuar spend generations guarding exactly what they said they were guarding? To understand what happened in 1976, you have to start with the people who were there first and who are still there. The Shuar are one of the great nations of the upper Amazon, living in the forested hills where Ecuador slopes down toward Peru. To outsiders, they were long known by a cruder name, the Jivaro, and by a fearsome reputation. They were the people who shrank the heads of their enemies, the people the Inca could not conquer, and later the people the Spanish could not conquer either. In 1599, Shuar warriors destroyed the Spanish gold mining settlements in their territory in a single coordinated uprising. The region was never successfully colonized again. It is worth pausing on that fact. The corner of the Amazon that holds the Tayo's caves belongs to one of the only peoples in the Americas who were never broken by European conquest. The cave the world now argues about takes its name from a bird. The Tayo, the oil bird, is a strange nocturnal creature that nests in total darkness, deep inside caves, navigating by echolocation like a bat. Once a year, traditionally, Shuar men would descend into the caves on ladders of vine and liana by torchlight to harvest the young birds for their oil. It was dangerous, ritualized work, wrapped in ceremony and preparation, because in the Shuar understanding, the caves were not simply holes in the ground. The deep places belonged to the ancestors and to the spirits. Shuar tradition speaks of the caves as a threshold, a doorway associated with Nunkui, the spirit of the earth itself, the mother of everything that grows and everything that lies beneath. To enter was permitted at the right time, in the right way, with the right respect. To intrude was another matter, and intruders noticed something. The handful of outsiders who reached the Tayo's caves in the early 20th century Missionaries, gold prospectors, the occasional military patrol came back with the same two observations. First, that the cave system was enormous, far larger than a hole in a hillside had any right to be. And second, that the Shuar treated certain passages differently from others. Some galleries were working spaces where the bird harvest happened. Others were not entered at all. There is a third observation, quieter than the other two, that appears again and again in accounts from the region: the entrance itself. The main shaft of the Cueva de los Tallos drops more than 60 meters, a 200-foot vertical fall through solid rock. And below it, early explorers described passages with strangely regular features, flat floors, right-angled corners, ceilings that ran level for long stretches. Geologists would later argue, reasonably, that sandstone can fracture in clean lines, but the men who saw those galleries by torchlight kept using the same word in their reports, the word that would eventually drag a moon astronaut into the jungle. They said the passages looked cut. Before we continue, if you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through historical records, archaeology, and indigenous traditions, consider subscribing. It helps the channel and allows me to keep researching stories like this one. Because in the summer of 1969, the same summer Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon, a Hungarian-Argentine researcher walked into a government office in Guayaquil, Ecuador, and made a claim so specific, so detailed, and so legally binding that it is still on file today. The man's name was Juan Moricz. He was a Hungarian émigré living in Argentina, a researcher obsessed with the idea that traces of a lost civilization survived in South America. By the late 1960s, his research had brought him to Ecuador, to the Shuar territories, and to the caves. On July 21, 1969, Moricz appeared before a notary public in Guayaquil and dictated a formal deposition, a legal document, signed, stamped, and archived. In it, he declared that in the subterranean galleries of the Tallos region, he had discovered objects of great cultural and historical value to humanity. Among them, a collection of metal sheets, plates engraved with signs and writing, a metallic library, he said, that appeared to contain a record of ancient history. He claimed the discovery as his own, requested government oversight for any future exploration, and offered to lead an expedition to verify everything he had described. Stop and consider what that document is. It is not a tavern story. It is not a book written for money. A man walked into a legal office and staked his name in writing on the existence of a library of metal beneath the Amazon, at a moment when the entire world was watching men walk on the moon, and no one was paying attention to caves in Ecuador at all. An Ecuadorian expedition with Moricz did enter the caves that same year, and its members confirmed the scale and strangeness of the galleries. But the metal library itself was never produced. Moricz insisted the precise location was his secret to keep, that the treasure belonged to Ecuador, but the knowledge of where it lay belonged to him. And there the story might have stalled, if not for a Swiss hotel manager turned best-selling author named Erich von Däniken. In 1972, von Däniken published The Gold of the Gods, claiming that Moricz had personally taken him into the tunnels and shown him the metal library with his own eyes. The book sold millions of copies worldwide. It also detonated the story's credibility. Moricz publicly stated that he had never taken von Däniken into the caves at all, and journalists concluded the author had dramatized, invented, his descent. The metal library was now world-famous and radioactive at the same time, wrapped in a scandal that gave every serious academic a reason to look away. But there was a problem with looking away, because the metal plates had a second, independent source, and this one you could walk in and see. In the city of Cuenca, in the Andes above the Shuar lowlands, lived an elderly Italian priest named Father Crespi. He had arrived as a Salesian missionary in the 1920s, and he stayed for the rest of his life, more than 50 years among the poor of Cuenca and the indigenous families who came down from the mountains and up from the jungle. They loved him, and over the decades they brought him gifts. What they brought him fills photographs and film reels that still exist, stone carvings, ceramics, and, most famously, sheets and plaques of metal, embossed and engraved with figures, symbols, and what look like columns of script, pyramids, elephants, serpents, writing that matches no known system of the Americas. Crespi hung them on the walls of a courtyard museum beside his church, and when asked where such things came from, he gave the same answer for decades. The people told him they came from the caves, from tunnels in the jungle, in the territory of the Shuar. Academics who examined the collection concluded that much of it was modern folk art, hammered brass and tin, made locally, given to a beloved priest who accepted everything with the same gratitude. That conclusion is almost certainly true for many pieces, but it has never fully closed the file. Because in 1962, before the arguments could be settled, the museum burned. The fire consumed part of the collection. What survived was crated away after Crespi's death in 1982, dispersed into storage, and much of it has never been publicly studied or even located since. Whatever the walls of that courtyard really held, the evidence was scattered before anyone with authority ever catalogued it properly. So by the early 1970s, the situation was this. A sworn legal document said there was a metal library under the jungle. A famous book said the same thing and was publicly discredited. A priest's courtyard in Cuenca was hung with metal plates that the establishment called junk and the donors called cave treasure. And the caves themselves sat exactly where they had always been, in Shuar territory behind a 200-foot vertical drop guarded by the descendants of the only nation the conquistadors never subdued. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of unresolved mess that serious institutions avoid, which is what makes the next chapter so strange, because the next people to organize an expedition were not fringe theorists. They were the British Army. The man who assembled it was a Scottish civil engineer named Stan Hall. Hall had read the claims and counterclaims, and he reasoned like an engineer. The argument could not be settled in print. Someone had to go down properly, down with surveyors, scientists, and enough logistics to map the system once and for all. Through personal persistence that took years, he pulled together something unprecedented, a joint British-Ecuadorian operation with support from both governments, the British Army and the Ecuadorian military. The scale is on record, over 100 participants, Army engineers and Special Forces support, professional cavers, geologists, zoologists, archaeologists, a medical team, aircraft, and weeks of supply lines cut into the jungle. It remains, to this day, the largest cave expedition ever mounted. Not for the deepest cave on Earth, not for the longest, but for a hole in the floor of the Ecuadorian Amazon that most of the scientific world officially considered uninteresting. And at the top of the expedition's letterhead was a name that made no sense and perfect sense at the same time: Professor Neil A. Armstrong, honorary president. Armstrong was, by 1976, the most reclusive famous man in the world. He had left NASA, taught engineering in Ohio, and turned down thousands of invitations that came with his name attached. He said yes to this one. He flew to Ecuador, traveled to the camp, and on the day of his descent, he was lowered on a winched cable down the 60-meter entrance shaft through the waterfall of daylight at the top into the dark of the Cueva de los Tallos. Think about the image. It deserves a moment. 7 years after the Sea of Tranquility, the first man on the moon hangs on a cable beneath the Amazon, descending into the earth. He would later say, in one of his rare comments about the trip, that he had now been to both places, the moon and the inside of the earth. And there are members of that expedition who recall that he seemed in the caves genuinely moved. What did they find? The honest answer comes in two halves. The first half is the official record, and it is substantial. The expedition mapped kilometers of galleries. The zoologists documented the oilbird colonies and catalogued species new to science. The archaeologists made a discovery that is real, physical, and sits in the record books: a burial. In a side chamber, the team excavated human remains interred in a seated position, accompanied by grave goods, shell ornaments that had travelled hundreds of kilometers from the Pacific coast, and objects dated to roughly 1500 BC. 3,500 years ago, someone carried a body down into that darkness, arranged it with care, and left treasures beside it. The deep caves, in other words, were not empty ground. They were a sacred site in active use when the pyramids of Egypt were already ancient. And the Shuar reverence for those passages was not a quaint superstition. It was institutional memory. The second half is the absence. No metal library. No hall of engraved plates. The expedition found no artificial tunnels. The geologists concluded the great galleries, for all their unsettling right angles and flat ceilings, were natural sandstone formations, fractured along clean joint lines. Case closed, said the report. Nature makes corners too, and yet the file refuses to stay closed for three documented reasons. First, the guides. The expedition entered the system through the main shaft, with Shuar cooperation negotiated in advance. But the Taos region holds more than one cave, and the Shuar had never claimed the famous entrance was the important one. Moricz himself, who refused to cooperate with the 1976 expedition when his terms were not met, insisted to his death that the expedition had explored the wrong system, that the library lay elsewhere, behind an entrance known to a handful of people. Second, the deathbed thread. Years after the expedition, Stan Hall, who never stopped working the problem, was introduced to an elderly Ecuadorian man named Petronio Jaramillo. Jaramillo told Hall a story he had kept mostly quiet for half a century, that in 1946, as a young man, he had been taken into a cave by Shuar friends as a gesture of trust, and had personally handled the metal books. Thousands of them, he said, stacked in galleries, some engraved, some polished, alongside other objects he could barely describe. He offered no photographs, he asked for no money. He gave Hall an approximate location, and the two men began planning a verification expedition. In 1998, before it could happen, Petronio Jaramillo was shot dead outside his home. The crime was never solved. Stan Hall spent his remaining years cross-referencing Jaramillo's directions with maps and satellite imagery, published his conclusions quietly, and died in 2008. His daughter continues the work, and the coordinates he identified, Noir River Junction, some distance from the famous entrance, have still never been systematically excavated. Third, and strangest of all, the silence at the top. Neil Armstrong lived 36 more years after Taos. The man had stood on another world, yet by the accounts of those close to the expedition, the caves stayed with him. He called the descent one of the experiences that mattered to him in a life where almost nothing impressed him publicly. And that is nearly all he ever said. No interviews about it. No chapter in a memoir. He never wrote one. The first man on the moon went into the earth looking at a legend of a metal library, came out and closed the door behind him. Skeptics read that silence as proof there was nothing to tell. Others noticed that Armstrong was famous for exactly one communication style. If it wasn't worth saying carefully, he didn't say it at all. So we are left with a ledger that refuses to balance. On one side, no metal library has ever been produced. The one book that claimed eyewitness proof collapsed in scandal. The Crespi collection was, at least in part, folk art. The 1976 geology report says the corners are natural. That is a real case, and an honest documentary has to give it full weight. On the other side sits a different kind of evidence, the kind this channel keeps returning to because it is the kind that institutions are worst at weighing. A legal deposition, sworn and archived, that predates the fame and the money, a collection that burned before it was ever catalogued, a witness who asked for nothing, told his story once, and was murdered before he could lead anyone to the spot. A 3,500-year-old burial proving the deep caves were sacred ground all along, and a tribe that never lost a war, telling outsiders for a century, in every way available to them, parts of this place are not yours to enter. Perhaps there is nothing down there but sandstone and birds. Perhaps the library was always a dream that grew in the dark, the way stories do. But notice what the Shuar tradition actually accomplished, whatever its origin. It kept the deep galleries intact for 3,500 years, long enough for the burial to survive untouched. It filtered who entered and how far. And when the largest cave expedition in history finally came, with soldiers and scientists and the most famous man alive, it was the Shuar who decided which doorway they were shown. The caves are still there. The Shuar are still there. Today it is their federation that controls access, and expeditions still enter only with their permission, on their terms. The coordinates Stan Hall left behind have never been dug, and somewhere in the archives of Guayaquil, a notarized page from July 1969 still says, in careful legal language, that beneath the jungle of Ecuador there is a library made of metal. The first man on the moon looked into the darkness it describes. Whatever he saw or didn't see, he chose to leave it there, guarded the way it had always been. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through historical records, archaeology, and indigenous traditions, consider subscribing for more investigations like this. And before you go, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you think the metal library is a legend that outgrew a scandal? Or is it still sitting in a gallery no expedition has entered, exactly where the Shuar never looked away from it? And should Stan Hall's coordinates finally be excavated? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next documentary.